This week's episode of our show is sponsored by Demeo, a fantasy dungeon crawler RPG that is for PC and also coming to PS5.
Monty and I have been having a blast digging into this game. We love fantasy RPGs, we love dungeon crawling, and if you haven't learned by watching some of our episodes, we love video games.
Demeo has been the absolute intersection of everything that Kelly and I have wanted in a video game for a while. A co-op game that is cross-platform, that just gives us those good old school D&D dungeon crawling vibes that we can just kick back, relax, and play together on a Friday or Saturday night.
This game has added in so many new character classes and different options for people to explore and play with in the game. And it's just been so much fun to dive into, and the VR is also really cool, but not required.
Between the card-based abilities and the dice rolling, it really captures that turn-based tabletop fantasy RPG feeling in a video game format. And I really like that it's simple enough that we can play two-player co-op with it, or we can invite a couple other friends in to play as well. For Kelly and I, Demeo really hit the spot, and so if you're looking for a great game to tide you over between your main sessions of D&D, this is probably the perfect option.
There's going to be links in the description below if you'd like to learn more about Demeo, and for now, on to this week's episode.
Greetings! My name is Monty Martin.
And I'm Kelly McLaughlin.
And we are the Dungeon Dudes. Welcome to our channel where we cover everything D&D, including advice for players and guides for GMs.
We upload new videos on Tuesdays and Thursdays, so please like this video, subscribe to our channel, and ring that bell so that you never miss an episode.
Have you ever planned a really big boss battle in Dungeons & Dragons? Set up that awesome map, got out all your miniatures, been super pumped for game night, and then put everything down only to have your player characters banish, disintegrate, stun, destroy your boss battle in like 2 rounds?
Yes. Almost every game session. So what we're going to do today is we're going to talk about some homebrew ideas that you can incorporate into your game to make your boss battles a little bit more interesting. Possibly allowing your bosses to last longer, or just making the combat more than just a disintegration ray away from total victory. There's a lot to discuss today, so let's get rolling.
So the first homebrew ability is one that we've a little bit adapted from our Dungeons of Drakkenheim campaign setting. For those of you that don't know, in the world of Drakkenheim, the ruined city is covered by a mysterious haze that prevents player characters from benefiting from a long rest within the ruins of the city. I created this mechanic because not only does it capture the feeling of adventuring in an irradiated wasteland, but it does a pretty good job of making sure that players go into the city for their adventures, go into the dungeon, explore, and really commit before they have to retreat for a long rest. What's cool about this is that there is a way to adapt this premise, though, of restricting where your player characters can take a long rest that can help you at least make sure that your player characters have to fight through the dungeon to get to the boss.
We're calling this ability Legendary Malevolence, and what it is that the malevolence of your boss monster radiates from them. They are the central point, so instead of a toxic haze, it's just that the area within 5 miles of your boss's lair is too dangerous to take a long rest. There's too many minions and monsters roaming around who might pledge allegiance to the boss monster, or just in general, anything that you can come up with that makes the territory too dangerous. You can even just simply say this area is too dangerous to camp out in. You cannot take a long rest. This is going to force the player characters to think about the resources that they are expending on the way to the boss monster and on the way back. They're going to have to plan, they're going to have to prepare, and they're going to have to be careful about how many spell slots and abilities they keep for when they arrive at the boss monster and need to do battle.
Now, of course, in response to this, your player characters are probably going to bust out Rope Trick and Liamon's Tiny Hut. And in Drakkenheim, these don't work. And so you might need a little bit more of a justification than the area is too dangerous. And this is where you can dive into the lore and personality of your boss monster to derive some reason why their presence has forever tainted the region while they're still there. Perhaps your boss monster is an Elder Brain, in which case it's super easy. They literally are haunting your nightmares, making it impossible to get a good sleep. But you could even extend this to a Demon Lord, or even possibly a dragon. The creature has such an intense presence of evil, and such this palpable psychic presence, that it makes mortals have nightmares whenever they're nearby. Works for a dragon, works for a lich, works for a vampire, works for a demon lord, works for pretty much any big monster. It could even be that the spellcaster or the cult is created some sort of ritual that is disturbing kind of the psychic vibes of the area, just making it impossible to take a long rest. And this also gives you a justification for why the boss's minions are not affected by this. They might not be mortal creatures. They're undead creatures, so they're immune to it. They might very well be constructs or elementals. Or they could have just sworn an oath or participated in the ritual that installed this effect in the first place, and so they're immune to it. They're not affected by it.
So overall, this rule is put in place to force the player characters to have to engage with the dungeon or the ruins or the area surrounding it, whatever they have to get through to actually get to the boss. There's so many times in our games where they're in the great dungeon about to approach the boss, and they kind of get the sense that the boss monster's coming up, so they clear out a few rooms and take a long rest, thus replenishing all of their abilities, healing back up to full health, and then going into a boss battle, which when you're at full health might not seem nearly as scary. This rule simply says, no, you need to battle your way through the dungeon, make it to the boss monster, and fight that boss monster with whatever you have, and then make it back out. Perhaps once the boss monster is dead, they can take a long rest because that evil dissipates from the area. You could also put in an element where this evil reincarnates or resummons or raises up dead minions. That way, the monsters that they are fighting in the dungeon, they can't take a long rest because those minions are going to come back if they do. This works really well for somewhere like Castle Ravenloft.
The next ability that we're going to introduce works in tandem with a very common solution that is proposed when designing a boss battle. It's a very common recommendation to add minions to any boss fight to bulk it out. I like to think of minions as like the fries to the hamburger of a boss battle. You know, you've got the meat there, you've got the big thing there, but then you've got the pile of fries beside it. But if you're like me, I eat the burger, then I eat the fries. And so in a lot of cases, it's possible for the player characters to be like, yeah, you're the boss, we're just going to put a target rate on you, destroy you, and then your minions are just going to run away and going to be easy to mop up afterwards. This rule is intended to help deal with that slightly.
We're calling this rule the Sacrificial Pawn, and this is one that Monty and I have implemented for years. The idea here is that there's a special bonus rule applied to all of the minions that the boss monster has. If a player character targets the boss with an attack, a spell, an ability, anything that would directly target the boss monster, one of the minions can use a reaction to jump in the way, essentially taking the bullet, taking the hit, taking the attack, and they basically just die or take the damage themselves, but thus preventing that damage from landing on the boss monster. Mind you, there's a few nuances to this. If they're hurling fireballs, you can't really use the Sacrificial Pawn rule. The area of effect abilities are still going to hit the boss, but this stops arrows and targeted spells from just jumping in there and allowing them to get to the boss before the players actually have to work their way physically either through the minions or up to the boss.
I like this rule a lot because it introduces an interesting tactical element that gives the players lots of ways to overcome this. They might use a fireball to wipe away all the minions, or they might use clever positioning and other techniques to move the minions away from the boss and to separate them from one another. And you can deal with this a variety of ways. Typically, when I use this rule, the minion has to be within 5 or 10 feet of the boss monster in order to jump in front of it, and it requires that minion to have a reaction available to do it. There's another version of this rule where the boss is actually using their reaction to grab the minion and hold them in front of that, which means that the boss can only do this once per round. So there's a couple different ways that you can implement this rule depending on the flavor that you want to have and how powerful and effective a defense you want it to be. But ultimately, it creates this interesting tactical dimension because players understand intuitively how this works, and they will try to find ways to combat it. Usually, it doesn't result in the players having to kill every single minion in order to defeat the boss. It does mean, though, that they have to think about positioning, they have to think about their tactics a little more, and use a variety of abilities to actually get through the boss's defenses. Another cool way that you can actually link this together with a few other mechanics is have the boss's legendary resistances tied to their minions. So when the boss wants to use legendary resistance, they're sucking the soul out of one of their minions, which kills that minion, but then allows the boss to automatically succeed on a saving throw. You could even have it for a similar way for their hit points, where the boss has an action that allows them to drain the blood out of one of their minions to fully heal themselves, or something along those lines.
I think that this is one of the most interesting rules to implement because really when we're designing combat encounters, the question is always how do we make this more than just a slugfest against the players and the boss? This does bring into play so many dynamics and thought processes that the players need to consider when they're going into combat. It turns it into a somewhat bit of a puzzle at the same time as being a combat encounter. Now we need to separate the boss from his minions. We need to clear enough space around him. We need to kill minions that it is using as a shield, thus allowing us the opening to kill the boss. And it just makes the whole thing more dynamic. And that's really what we want out of our combat encounters.
Now, sometimes you do actually want to have a solo monster that is the only foe facing the player characters. It's epic, it's cinematic, and in not all cases is it going to make sense for your big bad evil guy to have a horde of minions with them in the encounter. But there are still ways that you can capture the effects of this rule in other ways. And we call this technique the shield generator. Basically, the boss in their lair or environment has some sort of magic crystal, eldritch machine, soul pillar, arcane ritual circle, or some other force that is creating a protective field around them that makes them immune to all damage, and if you want to, it can even make them immune to status effects and anchor them to reality so they can't be banished as well.
These pillars or crystals or whatever they are have to be destroyed before the boss can be targeted. Otherwise, the boss is just invulnerable to all damage. There's so many variations on this rule that you can really go in a number of different ways, whatever suits your combat encounter. You could have 4 or 5 pillars in the room that are all channeling power into the boss, creating a shield. Same idea with a large crystal that has a certain amount of hit points. You could even implement something like the crystal lashes back when it's hit with lightning or electricity. Therefore, targeting it is scary, but they need to destroy it in order to get to the boss. You could do something like a summoning circle. There are 10 minions who aren't attacking in combat. They're essentially just pillars or crystals as well. They're performing a ritual that is protecting the boss. Until they are all killed, or at least their concentration on the ritual broken, the boss is invulnerable to damage. Another great way to do this is putting the boss on an epic mount, and any time that the boss is targeted, the damage goes to the mount first. I'm thinking of a lich riding a dragon. You got to kill the dragon before you can target the lich.
Or you could have a insane mage that has a super powerful shield guardian, and all the damage gets diverted to the shield guardian. This is an interesting way of kind of hybridizing the Sacrificial Pawn alongside the shield generator to have an interesting encounter where you've got a better action economy because you've got more things that are acting against the player characters in the midst of that battle. In effect, what all of these things are doing is they're giving your boss a buffer of hit points and creating that first couple rounds of combat where the boss isn't going to be able to be taken out by crowd control spells or stunned or anything. But it means that there's a set of actions the players can take to break that effect, and then they can completely unleash all their amazing powers and abilities on the boss. So rather than having to say to your player characters, no, you know what, their saving throw against your hold monster spell, they legendary resisted it, it's not going to work at all. This way, the player characters have an obstacle to overcome, but then if they want to hold Monster the Boss and crit them a whole bunch of times with all their huge Paladin smites, they're going to get the satisfaction of being able to pull that combo off, but they have to earn it first.
One of the cool ideas that you can also implement here is that once the pillars or the crystal is destroyed and your boss becomes vulnerable, it also powers them up, giving them new abilities, maybe granting them extra temporary hit points or a variety of other options. This leads into our next homebrew idea, which is the boss phases, or as I like to call it, this isn't even my final form.
Now, we've actually seen examples of this in some official 5e materials, and this has been a long-standing idea because so many video games and forms of media make use of this idea. We've seen examples of this applied in some of the ancient dragons that were introduced in Fizzbands. There is a boss encounter, spoilers for Rime of the Frost Maiden, but there is a boss encounter in that adventure that also very explicitly involves this idea. And I think the concept also appeared in some of the Mythic Odysseys of Theros, where basically the idea here is that there is a stat block for the boss, and when that stat block is destroyed, an entirely new stat block is summoned or emerges or appears, and now the players fight this. The secret here is that what you're actually doing is you're stringing multiple encounters in sequence with each other, because each phase of the boss is actually a completely discrete encounter on its own, just albeit one where the player characters don't get to rest between those phases.
This is another time that you can really reflavor this to match the theme of your campaign. Two of my favorite examples are if you look at something like a Final Fantasy boss, Sephiroth teleports you to a different location for each phase of the battle.
Yeah.
If you're fighting a high-level lich or wizard or any sort of magic user, this idea that they keep gaining power and teleporting the player characters to, like, now you're on a mountaintop fighting now in like the middle of a storm, and then suddenly you're in the heart of a volcano and he's teleporting you around the world to try to bring you to a place where he can bring your doom, but then you have to fight this boss on multiple different locations. Another one of my favorites is what I call the Resident Evil treatment, which is you're fighting the evil mage, the evil boss monster, the mastermind behind it all, and then as you kill them, they mutate into something much more horrible, a much larger, scarier monster. Yeah. This gives you your two phases of, we defeated the evil wizard. Oh, he just turned into some mutant dragon monster.
I mean, you see it so often. Like, Legend of Zelda does that. You fight Ganondorf, and then you fight Ganon. And who has now transformed from a swordsman into a giant pig demon of some kind. You, again, I think Sephiroth from Final Fantasy VII, or basically I think every Final Fantasy game does this with their final boss character. I think the Breath of the Wild does also do this, and most of the Legend of Zelda games usually have a change in scenery between the boss phases as well. So oftentimes you'll go from inside Hyrule Castle to Hyrule Field, where you have some kind of duel or some kind of fight. There's a change of environment, and so that is an interesting way if you can figure out a way to make that make sense, because it feels epic. Like, it always has felt super epic.
I mean, classic example that I've seen in so many video games is when you have, let's say, the Ganondorf type character transform into a giant pig demon Ganon, the floor crumbles and you fall down a level and there's something cool underneath.
Yes.
It's like now you're in the basement sewer system or something where you were fighting on the top of a tower.
Or the castle explodes and now you're fighting in the ruins of the castle. Although I also do like the inversion of it. I think a couple times, Sephiroth is actually a perfect example of this, but I'm pretty sure there's been a couple times where they've done this with Ganon, where the Sephiroth fight is super mutated, crazy, one-winged angel Sephiroth, but then you have that final Omni-Slash, like mano a mano moment as well. And so there can be a cool inversion of that where the boss has the giant mutated form that is destroyed, leaving behind like their vulnerable core, but at that point the player characters themselves have already put so much energy into it that it's kind of like that last desperate moment, right? And I think of this also, I think that the Metal Gear games have done this as well, where you fight the giant Metal Gear robot and then the pilot comes out of it and you have to have like the one-on-one duel, and it turns out the pilot has nanomachines, son. And so all sorts of crazy things can get invoked in all these things. And there's a lot of inspiration that you can draw on for this. And it might sound cheesy on paper, but it's wild, and it always works really, really well.
I've never seen it fail when they think they've defeated the boss, and then boss version number 2 comes out, and the player characters are like, oh no, we just blew all of our resources to kill that boss. And that last ditch battle, when they take on their final form, is always the like, how many spell slots do you guys have? Who's damaged for hit points? Do we need to start using healing potions? It's when it really gets to that sort of game, like navigating your game system and like trying to decide your resource management, which is a lot of fun for a final battle.
And that's also where you can have the opportunity to practice your best evil laugh and have your villain go, "You fools! Now behold my true form." It's hilarious, but I assure you that under the right circumstances, your players will laugh in terror in the worst case scenario.
All of these elements are great and they make really amazing boss battles, but one of the keys to a great combat encounter is adding in elements beyond just combat. And that's going to bring us to our final example, which is the puzzle boss. Now, oftentimes when I've ran puzzle bosses, I actually am not running it against what I would consider the big boss monster. This is usually smaller, still scary monsters. But what the trick here is that these monsters actually are unkillable or are constantly being summoned back. But there is a puzzle at play that needs to be solved in order to end the combat encounter. I did this recently in my home game where there was a puzzle box that was cursed and had an item that the characters needed to progress inside. But the moment they interacted with the puzzle box, undead started rising all around them. They had to fend off swarms of undead while solving the puzzle box, and once the puzzle box was opened, the remaining undead crumbled away.
In the epic conclusion to my time loop campaign, which was loosely inspired by Monty Cook's Tallis, the player characters had to battle on the moon, where there was a giant shrine where 7 chains anchored the universe in place. And there was a massive invasion of demons, and the leader of the demonic army would constantly get resurrected every time she was killed. The only thing that mattered was the player characters had to destroy and detach each one of these chains, and that was the core of the battle. But of course, the demonic army was always trying to undo them in the midst of this, and this was the cool kind of balancing element, is that when you have the puzzle fight, the boss and the monsters might be invulnerable, but you still want to create a situation where they can't be really ignored. So the player characters have to decide which of us are going to try to solve the puzzle and which of us are going to try to deal with the fight to keep them off their back. You might have a situation where the player characters need to make some skill checks or concentrate on a spell or take a certain action round after round. So maybe the rogue and the wizard have to work on that while the fighter and the cleric are holding the enemies at bay. You might even have a scenario in the puzzle fight where every player character has to take some sort of special action that is relevant to their backstory or their personality or their own abilities, so that role of who is fighting and who is solving the puzzle shifts over the course of the encounter. In this respect, the puzzle fight can often overlap with a lot of the different other elements that we've talked about leading up to this. And I will say that sometimes it is important, though, to carefully decide which of these elements you're going to incorporate and how many mechanics you're going to introduce into a boss battle. It's important when you are creating a puzzle fight, particularly for the climactic encounter of your game, that you still want to preserve those opportunities for the player characters to use their ingenuity and to use their incredible abilities, particularly if it's the final fight of the entire campaign, because you want to let the players feel like badasses, right?
I'd say generally you can use 1 or 2 of these per boss encounter. You don't need to use all of them. It's a bit too much.
Yeah.
When you are implementing a puzzle battle, generally you want a lot of the combat elements to remain pretty straightforward because they're also trying to deal with a puzzle.
Yeah.
You could combine something like the puzzle fight and the shield generator, where you have a bunch of minions that are getting in the way, and there's a puzzle that needs to be solved to defuse the shield of the main boss before they can nuke it. So you can really combine these in interesting ways that allow a much more dynamic battle, rather than just them entering the room and smiting the Lich in the face. They're going to have to do a bit of work, and they're going to have to think as a team on how they're going to overcome this final battle.
An interesting permutation that you can layer on top of this as well is the puzzle boss or the shield generator is a really cool opportunity to include a chase or a race. For example, the puzzle simply might be the shield generator is a mile away. Super easy. It's just that if the player characters don't cross that distance, they're going to get killed by the boss. So it's a race to see who can get there first. A really simple way to have a climactic chase encounter. Kelly's also right that you want to be careful in these scenarios how complex the boss's own abilities are beyond this. And also how complex the puzzle is. If I'm layering a combat encounter with a puzzle, I'm likely going to have monsters that probably aren't using the complex spells. Maybe they're using interesting battlefield control spells that prompt movement, but I really want to avoid those ones that have a lot of rules baggage to it. At the same time, I also want to avoid the more cerebral puzzles in favor of more physical puzzles, such as moving objects around or using a lock and key sort of situation. You don't want the player characters to be busting out a Sudoku puzzle or trying to solve a word puzzle in the midst of combat. That can kind of break the flow. I like to have a puzzle that requires the players to spend their action to interact with something and maybe make a skill check rather than someone having to, do math.
This is where I love actually looking at video games for inspiration for physical puzzles that can be implemented while combat's happening. And the puzzle could be the simplest puzzle you've ever thought of.
Yeah.
But because they're in the middle of a combat encounter, it's more interesting. The puzzle could simply be there are 4 blocks with symbols on them that go into 4 slots with the same symbols on them. They need to be lifted or levitated into those places. Very simple. There's no confusion here. Oh, this one has a symbol of fire on it. It goes into the fire slot over here. Great. Easy. But there's 8 monsters in the way between them and putting the brick in the slot. That's a good puzzle.
Yeah. In a recent encounter in Drakkenheim, I used a very simple Tower of Hanoi type puzzle. You know, that puzzle where you've got 3 pegs and several discs of different sizes, and you have to move the discs from the first peg to the last peg, but you have to stack them properly. It was just a 3-disc Tower of Hanoi puzzle, basically the simplest version of the puzzle, but it yielded an amazing encounter that worked really, really well with these monsters that couldn't be killed. In a similar manner, I've also done a matching puzzle, which, again, it was that very simple, like, here's the cards face down, just match the 2 cards. I think there were maybe 16 cards, or maybe it was even less than...
Yeah, and they were presented as floor tiles, and we had to, physically flip them and play a memory game while water elementals were coming out of drains and attacking us.
Super, super simple puzzles, but because they're combined with a combat encounter, it's interesting.
So hopefully these 5 homebrew ideas for your boss encounters help you spice up your game and bring your boss battle into a new phase, allowing player ingenuity and creative thinking to be at the forefront of what's going to make a really memorable combat encounter in your games of D&D. If you've implemented any cool homebrew rules into your boss battles, tell us about them in the comments below.
The videos that we create on our channel are made possible with the incredible generosity of our Patreon supporters. A big thank you to all of our patrons for being part of our community and helping make these videos possible. If you want to join our community, just follow the links in the description below.
And if you want to see basically all of these in play at some point, you can check out our live play in the Worlds of Drakkenheim, which airs Tuesday evenings on Twitch. You can find all the previous episodes right up over here.
And we've got plenty more great advice for Game Masters right up over here.
Please subscribe to our channel, like this video, and ring that bell so that you never miss an episode.
Thanks so much for watching. We'll see you next time
in the dungeon.